Oes nach mi maidin don mesugoch das glor.
The story that I'm going to tell you today, The Speckled Bowl, is truly one of my very favorite folk tales. People often ask, what's your favorite story? And it's a very hard question to answer, but I know this is one of the dearest and closest to my heart. It comes from Ireland, from a fantastic organization called the Irish Folklore Commission that was active from the 1930s to the 1970s. And they came into being when people realized that all of the stories that had been handed down truly from generation to generation by storytellers who could not read and who could not write, like my own grandfather, my father's father, when I saw his birth certificate, my grandfather, his father had to sign his name on the birth certificate, and there, as big as life, was a great big X mark. My own grandfather's father did not learn how to read and write, but these people knew hundreds of stories. But after World War I, when people went off to Paris and discovered radio and cinema, and they came back to the farms in Ireland, and they were no longer interested in receiving and passing on the stories. So the Irish Folklore Commission was born, and they went around the country collecting all manner of folk customs, food, clothing, dance, music, furniture, architecture, but also stories. They had ediphones, these great big sort of unwieldy machines that even by the time they started in the 30s, they were pretty outdated, but this was what they had. And they went around the country on bicycles, and they would find people who knew stories. Some people knew dozens and dozens of stories, and they would get them to talk into these ediphones, these long tubes that recorded onto a sort of a wax cylinder, like a paper towel holder. And then they would take these back to the university in Dublin, and they would transcribe them. You could listen on the same machine, and they would write down word for word the stories that these storytellers were telling. And they collected thousands of these stories, and they're still at the University College Dublin, these beautiful handwritten manuscripts in these sort of blue exercise books, hundreds, thousands of them. And I went there when I discovered this story, and I knew it was in the archives there. It was told by a man named Sean O'Hecketh in 1937 in Donegal, and he had learned it from his father, who we know had learned it from his father. So I was so excited. I thought, I'm going to go to Dublin, and I'm going to get to hear on these wax cylinders. I'll hear the voice of the storyteller who told this story. What I didn't know is that the great thing about Ediphone cylinders was that after you recorded on them, you could scrape them off and use them again. And this is what all the researchers did. So thousands and thousands of hours of the original voices of the original storytellers were scraped away. And the secretary there was very nice to me. Yes, I think she thought I was a little crazy. But I said, is there one even that I could hear, if I could just hear one of these people's voices? And she said, oh, the recording quality is just terrible. And it was all in Irish, of course, which I didn't speak. But I just, if I could just hear a few minutes. So they had one that they had preserved, and I was given permission to listen to it. And it sounded roughly like this. You had to really yell into these Ediphone tubes. So maybe some of the nuances didn't transmit. But anyway, that's the source of the story that I'm going to tell you today. And it is a fairy tale, but it has one element of Irish mythology that I should maybe say one word about before we get started. There's a couple of references to a geis or to Gesha. And this is a really important part of Irish myth. This is a sort of a vow or a curse, or it's a promise that people make that they cannot go against. It's usually women who give these geis to men. In this story, the woman has the gesh, which is really kind of interesting. But a king has a gesh that he can never refuse a meal from anyone who offers it to him. And he has another gesh that he can never eat the meat of a dog. So the story gets interesting when an old woman begs this king, this poor woman begs him to come to her house and to let her give him a dinner. And she brings out, of course, roasted Fido. And the king is in a quandary because he has two geshes that he has to obey. And the consequences are usually fatal or disastrous for future generations. You don't want to mess with your gesh. So, all right. So that's the only footnote that I have. And I get to say my favorite part of the story. Once upon a time. Once upon a time, and such a time there was. It was not your time, and it was not my time. It was not anyone's time. It was once upon a time. If I had been there then, I could not be here now. And since I am here now, I cannot have been there then. And if I had been there then and here now, then the story would be a different story, or the story would be no story at all. But I am here now. And this is the story. There was a prince who lived in Donegal, the son of a king and queen, and there was no finer man who had ever walked the earth than this prince. He was tall, he was handsome, he was regal, he was smart, he could sing the best songs and dance all the latest dances. And he was unmarried. And it didn't take Jane Austen to tell you that everyone in the village thought that this prince was in need of a wife. And when he would walk out hunting, or when he would walk out through the town, everybody looked him over and watched to see just who he might stop and talk with. Would it be the daughters of the gentry? No. Would it be the noble women? No, he passed them by. But there was one little house, just a cottage, some distance from the palace. But no matter where the prince was out and about walking, he always made it his business to pass by this little cottage where two sisters lived together. Now, Oprah Winfrey was not the first person to take an interest in royal marriages. It's as old as royalty itself to wonder just who the prince might be in love with. Was it the older sister or the younger sister? It didn't take two eyes to see that whenever he stopped at the house, he was always polite to the older sister. But the younger sister, he would lean over the fence and he would look her in the eye and he would talk and he would listen and he would laugh. And the neighbors talked and the neighbors listened and they said, oh yes, it was plain to see they were in love. And no one really was surprised when the prince asked for the hand of the younger sister in marriage. No one, except perhaps the older sister. She was devastated. She was shocked. She was struck. And she began to change. There was a jealousy in her that she truly did not know of until that moment when the prince asked her younger sister for her hand in marriage. But that jealousy, it began to bloom inside her mind. It began to push out other thoughts, other feelings, other emotions. She smiled at her sister and she told her how happy she was. And when the couple said, you must come and live with us in the palace, she was delighted to come with them, but only so that she might be close to the prince, not that she could be close to her sister. For her hatred for her sister grew day by day, sometimes hour by hour. And a year or more passed, and it was clear now that the younger sister was to have a child. And everyone talked and everyone was delighted. And the older sister thought in her mind, and her mind began to turn. And she said to her younger sister, now there'll be no one to care for you when the time comes but me. I won't trust any of these serving women or nurses or even the doctors here about. No, just me. I'll be with you, and I'll take care of you, she said. And her sister thanked her. And in the finest of fairy tale traditions, the prince was away hunting when the happy day came and the baby was to be born. And so the older sister sent all the attendants away. And she came into the room and she shut the door, and her sister cried out and cried out, but a baby was born, a baby boy, a magnificent, beautiful baby boy. And the older sister held this baby in her arms, and she felt such hatred, such anger, such jealousy towards this beautiful child. She took it as her sister slept, weakened from her labor, slept in the bed. The sister took this baby away out of the palace, out across the fields to the edge of the river. And she took that baby and she put it into a box and she pushed it off into the stream to let it travel away, 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 never to be seen again. And on the way home, she knew just what to do. There was a farmer that had given birth, the dog of this farmer had given birth to puppies. Yeah, she knew, and she asked for one. Might I have one of these dear little pups, she said. And of course they gave it to her, and she took the little thing home to her sister. And her sister still slept as she crept back into the room. And when the young woman opened her eyes, her older sister was staring down at her and saying, "What on earth? Sister, what on earth? Is there anything that you need to tell me that I should know? Where's my child?" said the girl. Where is my baby? Your baby. What? I can't believe it. I can't believe my own eyes, but this is your child. And she held the puppy, newborn, up to the eyes of her younger sister, who gave a cry. "What? No, my baby. Where is my baby? This is your child. I do not know what has happened, what has bewitched you, what spell has been put upon you by elves or leprechauns. I do not know. But we must be rid of this child. This thing is evil. This creature that has come from you, it must be destroyed. Do not worry, my sister. I will take care of it. I will take care of everything. You lie back." And so it was. She took the puppy to the edge of the pond beside the palace, and without any trouble at all, she drowned it. This is going to get worse. The king returned from his hunting trip, and the servants said, "Your Majesty, your wife, she's had the child. The door is locked. Her sister took her in there, but the baby has been born. We heard her crying out." And the prince ran through the doors, ready to see his wife, ready to see his child. But instead there was his sister-in-law, who said, "I don't know how to explain it. I don't know how to tell you this, but where's the baby? Where is my child? My wife, is she well?" "Your wife is well, but there was no baby. I watched with my own eyes. She gave birth to a pup. She gave birth to a dog, my own sister, your own wife. But it can't be," said the prince. "It is not possible. With my own eyes, I saw it. I showed it to her. Where is the pup?" "Where could it be?" she said. "But drowned in the pond. The unholy thing. I drowned it myself, and you should thank me. I don't know my sister, perhaps as well as I thought I did. Perhaps you don't know your wife as well as you thought. I can't explain it. Can you?" And the prince could not. And he went in and he held his wife in his arms, and he rocked her as she wept, and he wept, and they wept together. And the prince swore that they would go on, they would try again. Who can understand these things? Magic happens, curses happen, they're real. He knew that. Something must have bewitched his wife. They would go on. And they tried their best. But his heart had been jolted, shocked. And it was just then that the older sister saw her opportunity. For the prince was confused. The prince was frightened, and she was always there at his elbow, always there to soothe him, always there to console him. I don't know, she said. My sister, she's always been a strange one. There was talk of witchcraft at one point. We all laughed it off, but what else could it be? And day by day, hour by hour, she poured her poison into the ears of the prince, not literally, but as deadly as poison. And it began to destroy the love that he had for his wife. And one day, the sister came and said, if you wish, I think I know what can be done about that one, the other. If you'll leave it to me, I can put your worries to an end, darling. And he agreed. He agreed. His head was turned, his heart was turned, his mind was turned. He said, do as you see fit. And the original storyteller in 1947, he has a wonderful sentence now. At that time, there was a thing called magic. And the sister knew of it. And the sister had a hazel wand, a long, slender branch from a hazel bush. And she took this and she stripped it bare. And she said whatever words she knew over this hazel wand. And then she lay in wait for her sister one day. And as soon as she saw her entering at the door of the palace, she struck her with the wand. And the woman transformed into a slab of green stone that dropped onto the ground just at the rear door of the palace, the door where the cooks would come out each morning and take the filthy water that everyone in the palace washed their feet with at night, and they would pour it out onto that green stone there. I hadn't noticed that before, had you? No. But every day they would dump the filthy foot water onto the green stone that lay by the door. And they poured it on for days and months and a year. And after a year went by, no one thought about the young queen any longer, but it was her sister now who married the prince. And they lived happily ever after. Thank you for joining me. No, of course not. Don't be ridiculous. But she had what she wanted. She was married to the prince. She lived in luxury. She wore the robes that had looked so well on her sister. She thought they looked even better now on her. She had the prince by her side, in her throne and in her bed. And she was not happy. But let's leave her there for a while. What about that baby? He could float down the river and end up with 10 commandments, but that's not what's going to happen. That story had already been taken. But he did float down the river in that basket, far, far away, almost out to sea, which would have been the end of him. But there was an old fisherman who lived just there, just at the place where the river met the sea. And he had that very morning cast out a net. He had heard the fish were running. He was a poor man. The fish seldom filled his nets. But now as he pulled the net in, there was something. There was something there. And he pulled out a box. Buried treasure. No doubt. He'd heard about this. Crowns of kings long past, gold. Who knew what could be in this box, what treasure it held? And he opened it. And there was no gold. And there were no crowns and no jewels. But there was a treasure in that box. A baby. A baby boy, such a boy, such a magnificent baby. The fisherman was old, and his wife was old, and all their lives, as much as they had loved one another, they had only wished and wished for a child that had never come to them. And here it was, late in life, from the river he had worked by all his life, the river gave him this gift, his own magnificent boy. And he ran to his wife as carefully as he could. He didn't want to bounce the poor little thing that was sleeping away. And he said, look, it's come to us, our baby, our child. And if he had been overjoyed, then there's not a word to say how happy the wife was to have this child that took to them, that took to her breast, that fed from her, even as old as she was. They lived happily together, the three of them. And their neighbors were surprised, needless to say, but stranger things could happen. A baby born late in life, why not? They were happy enough. They loved the child, it was clear. And the neighbors told their friends, and the friends told their neighbors, and the neighbors told their neighbors, and the word spread as word does. And the word spread all the way to the palace, to the wife of the prince. Have you heard, ma'am? A child born to the fishermen at the edge of the sea. Old they are, but this baby's born, and they say there's no more magnificent baby ever born in Ireland. At the edge of the sea, a baby. They live near the river, don't they? That's right, ma'am. Perhaps you know, perhaps you'll go and see the baby yourself. Everyone says it is a magnificent child. I will, she said. And she did, because she knew. She knew what this baby was. It was the same child she had thrown into the river and wanted to forget. But she had not forgotten. And she knew. And she draped herself in a ragged shawl. She tried to cover the tracks of her own late begotten royalty. And she walked across the fields, and she walked across the paths, and she walked along the edge of the river until at last she came to the house, and the old woman greeted her, and she said, I've come to see the child. Everyone's talking. They say he's beautiful. Congratulations. Do you think I might come in and see the baby for myself? Oh, ma'am, it's kind of you. She said, just please come in. He is magnificent. And there in the cradle was her sister's child. And whatever it was she had tried to shut away, whatever she thought she was done with, it opened itself up again in her mind like a voice in her own ear, shouting, screaming at her. She knew what had to be done. And she looked at the woman and she said, what a beautiful baby it is indeed. It's just such a pity that it isn't yours. And what do you mean by that? Said the woman, and who are you to come into my house and tell me that my own child that I love with all my heart and more is not my own baby? Why would you say such a thing? I think he might have come to you in a box. He might have come to you down the river. Am I right? I won't answer that, said the woman. You needn't answer, my dear, because I know it's true. Haven't you heard the stories? Don't you know about the good people, the elves, the leprechauns, the others? Don't you know? This is what they do. This is what they want. They want their children in our homes. A changeling. Oh, it's beautiful. It comes to you from the river. You take it to your heart. You love it. You feed it from your breast. It's a changeling. This will grow. This child will destroy you. Surely you know the stories. And she did. She was a good Irish woman, and she listened all her life to the stories that they told of how the elves would come and steal babies from their cradles and leave the elf babies that would just stare into space or feel as cold as ice. And she said, but it can't be true. Look, it's a beautiful baby. You know, if you took it from that river, it is not your child. It is a changeling. And the woman wept and wailed and keened and swayed back and forth in her grief. She said, I loved it. I loved that child. And the wife of the prince looked at her kindly and said, leave everything to me. I know just what to do. Sobbing, weeping, she said, yes, ma'am, clearly you know best. Clearly you do. And she took the little baby and she handed it to the queen. This is the bad part. The queen walked across the same field she had come. She walked across the mud. Her robes trailed in the dirt and the mud, but she didn't see it. She didn't think about it. The baby, she held the baby at her breast, and the baby wriggled and squirmed, but she held it tight, and she walked on across fields, over paths, through mud. She didn't care. She just walked on, and the baby began to cry, and she held it tight to her breast, and the baby began to sob, and she held it tighter, and she held it tighter, and she held it, and she held it, and she held it. And the baby was dead. The baby was gone at last. And she knelt down there in the corner of a field. Two stone fences met just in a corner. And she looked about. There was no one. And she dug with her own hands, her beautiful fair hands. She dug into the mud and the dirt and the peat. And she dug as deep as she could with her own hands. And she took the baby. Maybe she cried, maybe she didn't. I don't know. I wasn't there. How could she not? She dropped the child into the earth, and she pushed the peat and the soil and the sod and the mud back, and she pressed it down. Lie thou there. And she walked home. And she washed the mud from her face and her hands. And she took off the robe that had covered her. She burned it in the fire. And she vowed she would forget. She would forget. I love this time of year right now, March. Every day I go out into my garden, and every day I look, and every day I see the tiniest bit of green. You always know a gardener when they can go out and look at a patch of mud and say, oh, wow, look, it's beautiful. All you need is one tiny green shoot to know that summer will be here, that the garden will be teeming with flowers and fruit. And the next morning, in that corner of the field where the two stone walls met, in that patch of mud and peat, one tiny green shoot pushed its way through the earth. No one noticed it. People walked past. Tiny green shoot at the beginning of spring. No one gave it any thought. But the next day, it had quite doubled in size. And the next day, it had sprung up and was clearly a tree. And the next day, and the next, the tree grew, not by the day now, by the hour. And people noticed it now. And they came and they watched it. It was magnificent, branch upon branch, and leaves sprouted out in the weeks of the spring, the early spring. The tree was decked in leaves and fruit of every kind of fruit began to appear on the tips of the branches, and there was so much fruit, and it was so magnificent, luscious, ripe, and the branches of the tree hung down, weighted with this fruit that grew, and it touched the very earth itself. The tree was splendid, and everyone came to see it. And the herd who took care of the prince's cows, he took all the cows down into that very field because he'd heard about this tree and he wanted to see it with his own eyes. And there it was. Stranger things might have happened, but he didn't know of them. And the cows, what did they care about a tree? None of them. They walked past it, eating the grass from the earth, all about the field. Except one cow. There was a speckled cow. Some say it was the herd's favorite, for he always watched over this beautiful speckled cow. And she walked directly towards that tree in the corner of the field where the stone walls met. And she licked a piece of the fruit with her long pink tongue, and she gulped it down. And then another, and she ate, and she ate, and she ate until any other animal would have burst. But she ate the fruit of that beautiful, magnificent tree. And that night, when the herd brought the cows into the barn, the speckled cow was so full of milk, she was ready to burst. And they came and they milked her, and they filled buckets, and there was still more milk in the cow. And they took more. They took great big vats and milked her, and the milk filled to overflowing. And it was the sweetest, the most delicious milk. And the next day and the next, the cow went to the field and she ate the fruit of that tree. And then it became apparent that the cow was with calf. The cow was to give birth. And it's important to understand that the prince had a herd of cows. He had no bull. And yet this cow was about to give birth. No one could understand it. They'd heard of something like this somewhere else in their daily life, but no one could think a child to be born without a father to the mother. It was a miracle. Who knew? Who cared? The cow gave birth, and the herd looked, and the cow gave birth to a young bull. Such a bull, such a magnificent bull, standing within hours of its birth and running within hours of that, and eating and growing and tossing his head and ready to fight with any of the other animals that it saw. It was a magnificent bull. And the bull grew, not by the month, not by the day. The bull grew by the hour. This magnificent speckled bull, no one had seen anything like it. And everyone talked. All the neighbors talked and told their friends, and all the friends told their neighbors, and the talk spread all about the speckled bull and how magnificent it was. And the talk spread to the palace. Have you heard, ma'am? The bull that's been born to your own husband's herd. It's amazing. No one quite understands it. There was a cow, and she ate the fruit of a tree that seemed to grow in a matter of days in a corner of a field. Oh, you would never have been there, ma'am. Here in the palace is where you stay, but it's just a little corner of the field where two stone walls meet, and this magnificent tree covered in fruit. And now the bull, this little bull, he is magnificent. You should go and see him. She didn't need to see him. She knew the tree. She knew that corner of the field. She remembered it well. And now her dreams were filled with this speckled bull. And all day she heard people say how the speckled bull would leap and play, how happy he was, how splendid he was. Really, she must go and see it. And the woman, she became ill with her dreams of the speckled bull. She tossed and she turned, and she would wake up in the night covered in sweat. And her husband, the prince, would say, my dear, what's wrong? What ails you? She said, I do not know, but I am sick, and I fear I will die. Unless, it's ridiculous, but the prince said, tell me, is there anything I can do to help you? She said, I know. No, it's nothing. And the prince went away. But that day, his wife went to the barn and she took a rooster and she slit its throat and she let the rooster's blood drain into a bowl. And then she carried that bowl to her bedroom and she put it beneath her bed. And she waited until she heard her husband, the prince, returning, probably from hunting. And as soon as he came down the hall, she reached for the bowl beneath her bed and she filled her mouth with the blood. And then she hid the bowl away again and she lay back on the sheets. And her husband came in and he said, my dear, my darling, are you better? And she coughed. And the sheet was drenched with blood. And she said, husband, I do not know what ails me, but I do know one thing, and I know it from my dream. If I cannot eat the heart of the speckled bull, then I will die. My dream told me this as clear as day. If I cannot eat the heart of this speckled bull in your fields, then I will die. And the prince staggered back. Stranger and stranger his life had become. But what could he do? He couldn't let his wife die for want of a bull. It was indeed a magnificent bull, but it would be captured, it would be killed, and she would be saved. And so he said to the herd, the cow herd, bring the bull in, we'll have its heart. The herd said, Your Highness, I don't know if you understand the power of this bull. We tried to catch him once. He did a lot of damage to many of your men. There were 12 of us with ropes. We tried to catch him, but no one could do it. No one could get close to him. He's a powerful bull. He's an angry bull. And the prince said, well, we must have his heart. If it takes every man in the kingdom to surround that field and capture that bull, you will do it. Yes, sir, said the herd. And it was just as the prince had said, every man and boy in the kingdom, hundreds of them, they made a great circle around the field, some of them with ropes, some of them with sticks, some with chains even. And the only creature in the field was the speckled bull, who looked up, who looked around and saw them coming closer. And the bull roared and reared and yowled and threw back his head, and they came closer and closer. And one young man who thought, there'll be favor from the prince, he took the rope that he held in his hand and he threw it around the neck of the speckled bull. And he pulled and he pulled and he held on tight as the bull began to roar and bellow and run. And at that point, it seems to me, the bull had enough. And the bull leapt into the sky, up and up and up above the tops of the trees, above the clouds. And the young man on the end of the rope held on for as long as he could, but he dropped down into the mud, and the March wind, God bless the March wind, as rough and powerful as it is, it picked the bull up, and it blew him away, 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 until he landed in the middle of a field owned by the king of the Eastern world. Mr. Lee, what is the king of the Eastern world? I don't know. The Eastern world. Nobody wanted to kill him in this place. It was very nice. The Eastern world turns up a lot in these fairy tales. It's far away. You could talk to any number of doctoral students about what it might mean. As far as I'm concerned, he's in a place where nobody wants him dead. It's lovely. And the bull ate the grass of the field, and he looked about him. It was nice here, this Eastern world. Perhaps perhaps he'd stay. People couldn't believe it. Did you see that? It dropped out of the sky. That bowl dropped out of the sky. They talked about it. Of course they did. They told their friends told their neighbors told their friends, and their friends told the king. Your Majesty, king of the Eastern world, a bowl dropped out of the sky and landed in one of your fields, and it is the most magnificent animal any of us has ever seen. You must come and see it. And the king of the Eastern world said, I'll do that. And he did. And there was a great crowd of people, men and women and children, all standing around, just marveling at this bull jumped out of the sky. Did you just see the thing? Look at it. Look at its power. It is magnificent, they said. And the king said, my daughter needs to see this splendid bull. Now, the king's daughter, for reasons which no one has ever seen fit to explain to me, the king's daughter was under a gesh. And the gesh was, as geshes go, it was very specific, it was very particular. She was never allowed to look at any man other than her father. The gesh stated that the first man who was not her father that this woman laid eyes on would be her husband. Whoever it might be, she would marry him. And this had been from the moment that she was born. So for all her life, she had worn a heavy blindfold around her eyes whenever there was the company of men other than her father. She would go on to intensive therapy later in life to deal with this strange childhood, but it worked for her. She wore the bandage around her eyes. She dealt with the serving women. She dealt with women wherever she went, and she spoke to men, but only blindfolded, and only her father could she see when she took the blindfold off. All well and good. Everything's called living. This was her life. And the king came to his daughter and he said, my child, have you heard this bull, this animal that dropped from the sky into our field? I've seen it myself. It's magnificent. I'm going to take you to see it. She said, Father, how can I do such a thing? The fields will be filled with people. You know it. I can't look at any man. He said, oh, I've thought of that. I'm going to send them all away. Everyone into your houses. Close your doors, shut your windows, lock your doors, get under your beds. You'll see no man but me, daughter, and this magnificent bull. Very well, she said, let's take a journey. And she put the bandage over her eyes. She put her hand in her father's hand, and he led her across fields and across paths, through gates, until they came to a field in the Eastern world where no one was about. All the people were in their homes, under their beds, hiding behind curtains. No one would be seen by the princess. And now, my daughter, said the king, it's safe, and you'll see. And he reached tenderly to his daughter's head, and he unwrapped the bandage, and he uncovered her eyes, and he said, look, my child, isn't it splendid? And the princess gave a cry, ah! And she dropped in a faint as one dead upon the earth. And the king ran to her and he said, my daughter, what's wrong? And she said, Father, why have you done this? Why have you shown me this man? Man, said the king, there is no man for miles around here. It's a bull. She said, Father, I am looking with my two eyes and I see there a man, mother, naked, a splendid man, as far as I can tell. You're the only one I've seen, but they can't all look like this one. I don't think, Father. But why have you shown me to him? He must be my husband. He said, daughter, I am looking with my own eyes and I see a bull. She said, Father, that's no bull. Father, put your right hand on my left shoulder. See with my eyes. And the king did. The king stood behind his daughter and he put his right hand gently on her left shoulder, and he looked beyond. And it was true, he saw a man. He took his hand off. Huh, 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 huh. I think I should go and speak to him. He said, yes, Father, you should go and do that because now, I have to marry him. You better let him know. And the king went over and he said, well, how do you do? And the bull replied, very well, Your Majesty. How are you yourself? Well, I'm not bad, but now you have to marry my daughter, you see. She's under a gesh. It's a long story. Tom Lee might tell it to you someday. I don't know. He's on a Zoom call at the moment. But if you could find it in your heart to marry my daughter. I know it's strange and all, you being a bull, but she insists you're a man. I think it could be done, said the man, said the bull, who was a man, who was a bull. And they were married, just like that. She married the bull. And he turned to her and he said, my darling, now I can tell you, I have been under a strange enchantment. And if I kiss you, it's over and we live happily ever after? Where'd you hear that? He said, no, it doesn't work like that at all, but I wouldn't mind a kiss. And she kissed her husband. And the spell at that moment was half broken. Half broken? What is this? Half broken? What are you talking about? Half broken. He said, I can be a man by day and a bull by night, or a bull by day and a man by night. But the enchantment upon me is only half broken, and you must choose. And this happens in lots and lots of fairy tales where an animal, a hedgehog, a camel, a snake is enchanted and then has to make this choice. His human bride has to make this choice. Animal by day and human by night, or human by day and animal by night. And when I tell these stories to third graders, they invariably say, which did she pick? And when I tell this story to eighth graders, I say, do I need to tell you what she picked? And they all turn red and say, no, it's probably pretty clear. She wanted her husband by night and a pet by day. And so it was with our fair princess. By night, her husband came to her, as magnificent as she had seen him, as splendid as she knew he was, and they were very much in love. And every day, he would go about his business as a bull on the fields that belonged to the king. And they lived in this way for several years, quite happily. She loved her husband and she accepted limitations. Who doesn't? It's a marriage. You have to work things out. And time went by, almost 7 years. And the king had a druid that came to visit him once every 7 years. And this druid knew everything. And every 7 years, he would come to the king and he would explain questions that had come up. He would give answers for puzzles that the king had. Anything that had happened in the past 7 years, since the druid had last been there, the druid would explain to the king. And when the druid arrived, the king said, am I glad to see you? And he told the story as I have told it to you, the bull that fell from the sky, the curse that had been half lifted, his daughter's happiness. But he said, I think she can do better. I think we could make a man of this bull. And the druid said, it can be done, but it will be dangerous to you, said the druid. Within the bull's horn, within his right horn, there is a tiny crystalline drop of liquid. If you break off the bull's horn and throw that drop of liquid just between his eyes, the spell will be broken. But pulling off the horn of that bull will indeed be a challenge. Remember, Your Majesty, when the man is a bull, he does not think as a man, he thinks as a bull. And what that bull wants to do is fight. What that bull wants to do is kill. And he will kill you. You will have to sacrifice all of the bulls in your own herd. Bring them into the field early in the morning where the enchanted bull is, and let him fight and fight and fight and fight until he exhausts himself utterly. And only then, when every ounce of strength has left his body, will you battle that bull, and you will break off that horn if you can. And if you strike him, your troubles will be at an end. And if you fail, and the king said, I will do it. I will do it. Rather than let my daughter live this life, I will take this risk. And that night by candlelight, when his splendid son-in-law came into the house, he told him the story that the druid had told him. And he said, tell me this, when you are a bull, will you know me? Will you remember what I have told you? And the man said, no, when I am a bull, I am a bull. Father, I wish you luck. And so the next morning at dawn, just after the magnificent man had transformed again into a bull and had been brought out into the field, the herd came with 1 and 2 and 6 and 10 and 12 of the finest, strongest, most powerful bulls in all of the eastern land. And he sent them in to the field, and the bull saw them and bellowed and charged and roared and kicked and stuck with his horns and kicked with his hooves. And the bulls died one after another after another. The speckled bull raged, and the storyteller says that the blood in the field was so deep, if you had walked in it, it would have come up to your ankles by the time the sun was beginning to set. But still, the bull was roaring and raging and filled with power. And the herd had one bull left, the strongest of all the king's bulls. And he let this off into the field, and the two bulls came together with such a roaring, such a clash. They say that in that kingdom, all the women who were pregnant gave birth at the same moment, and all the old people who were ready to die died in their beds. And some of them went and hid in caves, and some of them hid beneath their beds. And it was a night that people are still talking about in that kingdom. If you ever go there, be sure and ask them. But in the end, the speckled bull defeated the final bull, and it was clear he was growing weak. He huffed, his great lungs gasped out breath in great clouds in the frosty evening air. And the king knew it was now or never. And the king entered the field, and the king pulled off his robe and revealed the magnificent red lining of his own robe. And the bull turned and summoned every ounce of strength he had and came running, bellowing towards the king. And the king fought with the bull, and the bull tried again and again to gore the king. And he fought and he wrestled and he threw the king down upon the earth, and they rolled in the mud and the dirt. And the king reached up at one moment and he grabbed the bull's right horn and he pulled, and with a great crack, the horn came off, and the king ran as far away from the bull as he could, with the bull trotting behind him. He had one shot. He took the horn and he threw, and one crystalline drop of liquid flew through the air, and it struck the bull between the eyes, and he fell upon the earth, transformed to a naked man, covered in bruises, covered in mud, covered in blood. And the king, with tears of joy, lifted the man up in his arms, and he said, "My son." And he carried him back to the palace, And he said, my daughter, here is your husband. Become a man. Did they live happily ever after? Not yet. They were happy. There was a great wedding. They decided to have another wedding. The first one had been a little bit strange, but now they pulled out all the stops. It was a magnificent feast that was held. Everyone celebrated. And the princess said, what's next? Happily ever after? He said, no. I have to go home. I have memories in my mind. Memories from before I was a bull, from before I was a tree, memories from when I was a baby. And I need to go home and set some things right. I'll return to you. She said, you won't return to me because you're not going to leave me, because I'm going to come with you. He said, very well then, come along. And they got into a ship. And I don't know the directions from the Eastern world to the Western world, but he did. And he traveled by day and he traveled by night. He traveled over waves and he traveled with wind. And he traveled until he came home to the palace of the prince, who's always referred to as the prince. He hasn't become king yet. I don't understand it. But anyway. And what was happening, but a christening, a baby had been born, and there was a party, a magnificent party. And this was before COVID, so there was no Zoom involved. People were actually in the room with one another, and they were eating, and they were laughing, and they were feasting, and they were telling stories, because that's what you did at a christening. You told stories, and the stories passed. And the prince came into the room, and he stood in the back, and he smiled. The man who had been a bull, he watched and he listened, and everyone noticed him. He was so handsome, so magnificent. They invited him to eat and drink, and then they said, whoever you are, wherever you're from, you see, we're telling stories. It's your turn. Do you have a tale to tell? Do I have a tale? He said. Well, I do, but I'm not really sure how this story should end. And I wonder, all my life, I've searched for the right ending to this story. I wonder if you know, if you could help. I said, we'll listen. And the prince's wife was there. And she said, tell your tale, stranger. We give fair judgments in this kingdom. Tell us. We'll end it for you. And so he began. Once upon a time, and such a time there was. It was not your time, and it was not my time, and it was not anyone's time. It was once upon a time. There was a prince, the most magnificent man who walked the green earth, and he loved a younger sister. And so he told his own story to the company that listened in rapt attention to all that had been done to him, all that had been done to his mother. And he came to the end of the tale, and he turned to the queen and he said, and so I wonder how this story should end. Perhaps you can advise. And the wife of the prince said, I can barely imagine such cruelty. I can barely conceive of such evil. But in my role as ruler, I sometimes must mete out judgment. And I have heard that one as evil as this might be placed upon the roof of her own palace, left to eat whatever food the wind might bring her, left to drink only whatever drops the rain might offer her. And the stranger said, it's a fair ending to the tale, and it will be your fate. And he grabbed the hazel wand that she held in her hand, and he said to the company, come with me. And he walked to the back door of the palace where the green stone had been struck by years and years of filthy water from filthy feet. And he took the hazel wand and he struck the stone. And there rose up a woman, his mother, and he embraced her. And they wept together. And They doused each other with their tears, and they dried each other with their kisses. And I may be a good storyteller, but I'm not a good enough storyteller to tell you how happy they were. But I can tell you that everyone took the false bride of the prince. Well, there was no denying the story was true, and she was put upon the roof, left to eat whatever food the wind might blow her way, and to drink only what the rain might offer her. I don't know what happened to her. I've had enough of her. Like some presidents, I never want to think about her anymore. Let's be done with her. And the magnificent young man took his mother back to the boat where his wife, I think I forgot to tell you, she was waiting for him all this time in the boat. And they were to travel home. And I was telling the story for the very first time in New York City. And I was just about to say where they lived happily ever after. And someone in the audience said, wait, what about the fisherman? So I have altered the story for all time. My contribution is that on the way back to the Eastern world, they made a little detour at the edge of the river. And there was an old couple. And the woman said, have I seen you somewhere before, darling? And she said, yes, indeed you have. You pulled me from the river and you loved me almost as much as my own mother. Will you come and live in my palace with me? You and your husband, you'll be the royal appointed fisher folk of the Eastern world. And so they did. They left their home without a second thought. They all returned, and there was such a party going on when they came back. I think it's still going on, and we might be able to get an invitation if we try. But the only thing left for me to tell you is, say it. Pretend you're third graders and just shout it out. They all lived happily ever. That is the Speckled Bowl, as it was told. And I tell it to you, and I hope you will tell it to somebody else. Thank you for your time and your attention.